the new God of humanity, the new gods of humanity, a new God of humanity, the new goddess of humanity, the new goddesses of humanity, a new goddess of humanity, the old God of humanity, the old gods of humanity, a old God of humanity, the old goddess of humanity, the old goddesses of humanity, a old goddess of humanity, the greater God of humanity, the greater gods of humanity, a greater God of humanity, the greater goddess of humanity, the greater goddesses of humanity, a greater goddess of humanity, the lesser God of humanity, the lesser gods of humanity, a lesser God of humanity, the lesser goddess of humanity, the lesser goddesses of humanity, a lesser goddess of humanity, the greater spirit of humanity, the greater spirits of humanity, a greater spirit of humanity, the lesser spirit of humanity, the lesser spirits of humanity, a lesser spirit of humanity, the major God of humanity, the major gods of humanity, a major God of humanity, the major goddess of humanity, the major goddesses of humanity, a major goddess of humanity, the minor God of humanity, the minor gods of humanity, a minor God of humanity, the minor goddess of humanity, the minor goddesses of humanity, a minor goddess of humanity, the superior God of humanity, the superior gods of humanity, a superior God of humanity, the superior goddess of humanity, the superior goddesses of humanity, a superior goddess of humanity, the inferior God of humanity, the inferior gods of humanity, a inferior God of humanity, the inferior goddess of humanity, the inferior goddesses of humanity, a inferior goddess of humanity, the ancestor God of humanity, the ancestor gods of humanity, a ancestor God of humanity, the ancestor goddess of humanity, the ancestor goddesses of humanity, a ancestor goddess of humanity, the ascendant God of humanity, the ascendant gods of humanity, a ascendant God of humanity, the ascendant goddess of humanity, the ascendant goddesses of humanity, a ascendant goddess of humanity, the descendant God of humanity, the descendant gods of humanity, a descendant God of humanity, the descendant goddess of humanity, the descendant goddesses of humanity, a descendant goddess of humanity, the transcendent God of humanity, the transcendent gods of humanity, a transcendent God of humanity, the transcendent goddess of humanity, the transcendent goddesses of humanity, a transcendent goddess of humanity, the future God of humanity, the future gods of humanity, a future God of humanity, the future goddess of humanity, the future goddesses of humanity, a future goddess of humanity, the present God of humanity, the present gods of humanity, a present God of humanity, the present goddess of humanity, the present goddesses of humanity, a present goddess of humanity, the past God of humanity, the past gods of humanity, a past God of humanity, the past goddess of humanity, the past goddesses of humanity, a past goddess of humanity, the God of humanity, the gods of humanity, a God of humanity, the goddess of humanity, the goddesses of humanity, a goddess of humanity, the half-god of humanity, the half-gods of humanity, a half-god of humanity, the half-goddess of humanity, the half-goddesses of humanity, a half-goddess of humanity, the vessel of humanity, the vessels of humanity, a vessel of humanity, the person of humanity, the persons of humanity, a person of humanity, the image of humanity, the images of humanity, a image of humanity, the imagination of humanity, the imaginations of humanity, a imagination of humanity, the belief of humanity, the beliefs of humanity, a belief of humanity, the thought of humanity, the thoughts of humanity, a thought of humanity, the word of humanity, the words of humanity, a word of humanity, the action of humanity, the actions of humanity, a action of humanity, the reaction of humanity, the reactions of humanity, a reaction of humanity, the situation of humanity, the situations of humanity, a situation of humanity, the circumstance of humanity, the circumstances of humanity, a circumstance of humanity, the relationship of humanity, the relationships of humanity, a relationship of humanity, the number of humanity, the numbers of humanity, a number of humanity, the formula of humanity, the formulas of humanity, a formula of humanity, the equation of humanity, the equations of humanity, a equation of humanity, the symbol of humanity, the symbols of humanity, a symbol of humanity, the color of humanity, The colors of humanity, a color of humanity. The thing of humanity, the things of humanity, a thing of humanity. The way of humanity, the ways of humanity, a way of humanity. The place of humanity, the places of humanity, a place of humanity. The time of humanity, the times of humanity, a time of humanity. The event of humanity, the events of humanity, a event of humanity. The result of humanity, the results of humanity, a result of humanity.